When I was working on the project, I really thought it was easy. Really, I did. I just thought, oh, because the cubic buff and the health boost Beta has, Vessel is more skill based. But then I looked deeper.
Something was wrong with it. That's not human, man. He wasn't regular, man. Vessel was the devil, man. Vessel was the devil. All of us over here torturing the guys, man. I ain't gonna lie to you, man. It is what it is, but some people need to be gone, guys, man.
As of now, there are 7 juggernauts in the game, but I believe there are only 2 in which it requires a significant amount of skill to use. Vessel and Beta. If we count up the M1s, then both juggernauts have 8 functions, exactly 2 of which don't do damage, which is Cubic Buff and Purity Roar. This video is up to interpretation and I have no bias with other juggernaut. Both juggernauts have different playing styles and the DPS could vary. I mean, I main Veil Buster if you want to hear that.
Watch this shit.
Yes, it worked! And this is just my take on it. To accurately measure M1s, I did my own M1s of an auto clicker to measure a couple things. Wind up, which is the time it takes after you clicked that the action would execute, duration, basically how long the ability lasts, and cooldown, which is the time it takes before you do the M1 or ability again. Keep in mind that I measured this by 30 frames per second for simplicity, and then I used the wiki for cooldowns. We are going to measure 2 things. Attacks per second and damage per second. More APS equals more registers needed to kill, making a good indicator for the amount of skill required to use an item. Of course, the less DPS there is, the better it is in this context. By the way, Cubic Buff is not calculated until the total DPS is measured. Let's start with Vessel. Vessel's Soul M1 triple slashes does 25 damage and has an APS of 0.31. And this includes the countdown after the third M1. Compare that to Beta's Cubic M1, which is 18.5 without poison, and 28 with poison. I calculated with poison, and it has an APS of 0.83, significantly more. Both DPSs are almost identical, 23.33 on Beta compared to Vessel's 23.86, not that much. The Purity Parry, which I will still call it M1 because you left click to parry, is 65 damage. APS, if you consistently use it, would be 0.77. Beta's Ranger does 17.5 damage and has an APS of around 1.2. The DPS is very significant though, as Vessel would do around 50 DPS, assuming that you hit all parries, and 21.08 DPS on Ranger. This was a bit challenging to calculate, had to account for the reload times, the magazine size, and the fire rate. Although it is not hard to get a high APS for Ranger, the accuracy can vary. The Shade M1 Lunge does 35 damage with an APS of 0.13. The Retro M1 does 35 damage with an APS of 0.53. Probably a no-brainer that the DPS for Lunge would be pretty low, 4.79 damage, compared to a staggering 18.42. The Cubic Buff, which for 15 seconds gives you 2 times the damage, does change how much total DPS there is. I calculated this to be 1.33 attack damage if you consistently use the Cubic Buff. More on the calculation later in stats. The cumulative DPS of Beta with the average buff is 83.78 DPS, which Vessel only has 77.99 DPS, almost 78. Beta has a 6% improvement over Vessel in terms of M1 DPS, but the APS required for Beta is a staggering 209.4% more than what Beta does.
But Paxi, isn't Ranger Essence too high of an APS DPS because you assume that all the bullets hit?
Great question. Let's calculate based off my data. Let's assume 45% of bullets hit the target because of the slow velocity, compared to 21.08 DPS. The one with a 45% accuracy is 9.49 DPS. This would actually help out Beta because despite having the same APS, the DPS would be significantly less. Vessel has a high horizontal and vertical mobility with 25 speed and 70 jump, but with less health, only 200 base health and 375 more for every player past 2. Beta has more health with 400 base health, increased by 550 for each player after 2, but has a walk speed of 18 and no jump boost. Holding the Ranger Essence will give you 4 less speed. The only things I have modified for the stats are the speed and attack for Beta, and the defense for Vessel. The attack for Beta is calculated from the duration of the buff, the cooldown after the duration passed, and the cubic buff attack, which is 2. The equation is the duration of the buff divided by the total cooldown times the buffed attack, which is 2. Plus the cooldown of the buff divided by the total cooldown times the normal attack, which is 1. The speed for Beta is odd. The cubic leap ability gives you 40 speed briefly, so I have to calculate that in. I took the mean speed for hoarding each item, which is 16.67, and basically did the same thing for the attack, but replaced attack with speed. The equation for that is the duration of the windup divided by the duration of the cooldown times the speed of the cubic leap plus the time of the normal speed after the ability divided by the duration of the cooldown times the mean speed. Let's just hope that you got all of that. Calculating the defense for Vessel was even more difficult, but don't worry, I will make it simple. If I have an ability that lasts 1 second with a 2-second cooldown, that means when I divide 1 divided by 2, then I would be able to do the ability 50% of the time. Let's talk about the equation. It's the percent uptime of Soul Dagger's duration divided by cooldown times Soul Dagger's defense, 20, plus the percent uptime of Purity Roar times the Roar defense, 75%, which comes out to 19.5 defense. If we do a cumulative total of the stats, then Beta would win. Compared to Beta, Vessel has 36.27 better stats than Beta. Again, we will calculate APS and DPS. For Vessel, if you hit every dagger, you could do 165 damage, but keep in mind, Vessel will trail off your aim. In that moment, you can't move, but you do have 20% defense, which I mentioned before. The APS is 0.09. Beta's cubic leap, on the other hand, is 0.07 APS, slightly less. The DPS of Soul Daggers is 15, while cubic buff is 3.48. While the APS does have a 22% difference, the DPS is almost 3 times more. Soul Pillars do 35 damage per pillar. It's possible for the pillar's hitbox to not hit the player, or have 2 pillars hit the player, stacking 70 damage. I just made it 57.5, or the mean of both scenarios. Both scenarios meaning that one of the pillars hit or 2 pillars hit. If you're really that skilled, it would be one or the other and not 0. For simplicity, Zoner does 15 damage per tick, 0.5 seconds, and I will not include curves for simplicity as well. The APS for Soul Pillars is 0.06, while the Zoner is ironically around the same, 0.6. Does that mean the DPS for Zoner would be almost the same? No. Pillars has a DPS of 3.17, while the Zoner does significantly more at 28.3. This is of course assuming that you are not in the area of damage of the Zoner for the whole duration. When you do Purity Roar, there's a 5-second cooldown before using Focus. I have implemented this in the APS and DPS. Focus summons 6 predictive AoEs, the first one doing 30 damage and the rest 10 damage, all inflicting hit stun up to 80 damage. Despite being immobile, you have no defense. The APS is 0.06, Retro Stomp does 18.5 damage with an APS of 0.11. Does twice. The APS equals 2 times the damage per second. The damage per second for Focus is 3.72, while Beta does 7.72, so around 2 times better, which the answer is no. Shade Void Tendrils does 29.24 damage with an APS of 0.12 APS. Retro Stomp does 35 damage with an APS of 0.27 APS, so about 2 times attacks equals 2 times the damage. Void Tendrils does 3.49 damage per second, where the Sprint does 9.46 damage per second. 3 times our damage, but only 2 times the attacks, so no in this case. With the buff, Beta has a higher DPS at 65.31 DPS compared to Vessel's 25.39 DPS, a 157.23% improvement. The APS does favor Vessel in this case with a 0.33 cumulative score compared to 0.52 cumulative score on Beta's side.
Hex, is it the zone or low skill because it continues doing damage for 18 more seconds?
Great question. Most players would try to get out of the zone as quickly as possible, taking 1 to 3 hits if they were in the zone. If that was the case, the DPS would be significantly lower at only 3 DPS, and actually, it would hurt the case that Vessel is better since the percent gap actually closes more with only a 51.68% instead of a 61.12% DPS increase, with the new DPS for beta being 31.56. Since the APS did not change, that means beta wins with 57.59% more APS compared to 51.68% edge that Vessel now has on DPS. Of course, no curse, so this may be inaccurate. Since nobody stays in the zoner after the first 5 seconds from my observations, I will conclude that the new DPS change is more accurate and that beta gets the point. Beta comboing is more difficult than Vessel, but you have less options to choose from, which does make it a little bit easier. You can cubic leap and retro stomp at the same time, which the retro stomp would hit the target and it would finish it off with a cubic leap. This does 63.5 damage assuming the pillars hit the user, but if you add the buff, that's a total of 127 damage, enough to kill normal health players.
Blows up with mine.
It's a matter of timing and where you are to use retro for a quick one item combo. E stomp and time the R retro sprint so that while the player is ragdolled you can just hit the sprint, which does 53.5 damage. So you will have to finish it off with a retro M1 and then quickly switch to a cubic M1, but with the cubic buff it would already be enough damage. 107. An obvious one would be cubic buff and spamming the ranger essence, but that isn't really high skill. Really good damage, especially with the curse from the zoner. There are many combos for Vessel, so you have Purity Roar plus Soul Daggers, which does up to 200 damage, and if you can't finish it off with the Purity Roar and the combo, you can just try Soul Pillars after that. Void Tendrils plus Parry. I would typically use this after the Purity Roar for more curse damage, but if you don't, then make sure the player is at or below 94.24 health for this to work. Otherwise, this won't work. Soul Pillars and a Shade M1 Lunge. Although sometimes it will be around 30 health left if the pillar hitboxes are not hitting both. Just finish it off with 2 Soul M1s. Soul Pillars plus Soul Daggers, you can get them while ragdolled and it does pretty good damage. To stack melee damage quickly on beta, you have to first use Retro M1 and Cubic M1. The Retro Animation and M1 registers even if you unequip the Essence. I say start with 1 retro for every 2 cubics. Start with a retro first, then quickly switch to a cubic as the retro M1 will continue. For Vessel, stacking damage is also easy. Triple slashes and a lunge, which is easier. But what's faster at killing a normal health dummy? Let's see both side by side. It's clear that Vessel is slightly better than beta in comboing without the buff, but without the buff, well, it isn't really a competition. I believe that because of the cubic buff, Vessel would win in terms of comboing. The only thing close to this would be the Purity Roar, but that's within a radius and I'm not calculating curse. Vessel has Fault Protection with all of its abilities and M1s that do movement, e.g. Triple Slashes, Lunge, and Soul Pillars. In recent changes, the only maps that would be applicable would be Critical Strike, Townie, and Crossroads. I will not account for this since this is seldom used, but that is something to keep in mind of. In conclusion, if you add all the percents within the comparisons, then beta wins by a long shot, 175.43%. But to be honest, you will only feel it on the APS. See, while beta tanks more damage, the APS makes that number more difficult to attain. For shutting down strong ranged items, both do an excellent job. Yes, despite the lack of range, the speed does make up for Vessel. And to be honest, Vessel is more fun to play with the stat boosts and combos, making it easy to do quick and powerful M1s, but it is very difficult to get hit from. Beta has a more beatdown playstyle with the cubic buff ability, prioritizing raw damage and health over mobility, making the Juggernaut a little easier to hit, but does substantial damage on abilities and M1s. The reason why I didn't mention Mihawk is that there are only 3 functions and 1 M1 weapon, which the only reason why it's difficult to play was the health nerf. It's like putting Vestal health on beta, as which I mentioned before, is supposed to take a bit of damage. And by the way, there is no long range shutdown weapon. There's nothing. Like, seriously. Let me know in the comments, what do you think, which Juggernaut is better? By the way, I am so sorry that I have not been posting this video. It took way too long to finish all the calculations, and I've been procrastinating for a bit. Anyways, that's it for this video. Peace out.